Hans Hermann Hoppe.
And it is politicians who are the masters who stipulate that aggression, invasion, murder and war are actually self-defense, whereas self-defense is aggression, invasion, murder and war. Freedom is coercion and coercion is freedom. Saving and investment are consumption, and consumption is saving and investment. Money is paper, and paper is money. Taxes are voluntary payments, and voluntarily paid prices are exploitative taxes. Contracts are no contracts, and no contracts are contracts. Expropriation is restitution, and restitution is expropriation.
Hoppe is a rarity among public intellectuals in that when you read his work, you feel like you're hanging out with the cool kids. Monarchy is closer to freedom than democracy. Non-aggression allows for the physical removal of socialists and Democrats. That's some hardcore stuff, and somehow he defends it all with surprising convincingness. Coolness is not usually something you'd associate with an economics professor, but if Hoppe isn't cool, I don't know what is. I mean, look at that. I have never seen an aging intellectual pull off alternative rock artists so well. He's sharp, transgressive, and strikingly original. In this way, he's like pre-Grey Mirror era Moldbug, or how I imagine it would have been to read Rothbard in the 90s. After reading him, everything else has a faint, stale, hackneyed scent to it. He's like a really dank meme that only those immersed in a certain subculture really understand, but that everyone around that subculture pretends to get in order to seem cool. You would feel comfortable looking down your nose at someone who expresses disapproval or disagreement because they just don't get it, man. A lot of the time, that dismissiveness is actually kind of warranted. The hordes of NPCs calling Hoppe a racist, fascist Nazi really do deserve the eye roll and the helicopter joke in place of a serious response. The entry-level libertarians saying that Hoppe's border positions make him not a real libertarian really do deserve to be mocked. However, some of the time it gets in the way. I worry that the smug dismissal might have become such a habit that it could be used to shield Hoppe from some situations where he's just wrong. I would really like for Hoppe's argumentation ethics to work. I mostly agree with its ethical conclusions. I think that the idea of starting from argumentation in a philosophical pursuit is a very useful one. Hoppe was one of the 3 most important intellectuals on my journey to libertarianism. Entirely aside from his undeniable coolness, Hoppe has produced an enormous amount of important, brilliant, and original work. And I do not want one of his most defining contributions to libertarian thought to be fallacious. However, fallacious is what it is. I would also like to head off at the pass the idea that I am oversimplifying. My response will be simple, but the argument itself is very simple, as Hoppe himself agrees.
When I had finally worked out this argument, I was actually struck by how simple and straightforward it was. I was almost astonished why it had taken me so long to develop, and even more so, why no one else apparently had thought of it before.
Argumentation ethics is an argument for libertarian ethics, that is, private property and voluntary association. He claims that libertarian ethics can be proven a priori, or through pure reason, with no supporting evidence. Which is important because if he can do that, then libertarian ethics becomes as sure as 2 + 2 = 4. Argumentation ethics, in short, is the idea that libertarian ethics, basically private property and voluntary association, are the only ethics which can be defended by rational argument without running into a performative contradiction.
The truth or validity of the norms or rules of action that make argumentation between a proponent and an opponent at all possible. That is, the praxeological presuppositions of argumentation cannot be argumentatively disputed without falling into a pragmatic or performative contradiction.
A performative contradiction is something like, I can't talk, right? It's not a regular contradiction like this wall is both white and not white, where the content of the sentence contradicts itself. Rather, it is a statement which is disproved by the act of being stated. Hoppe claims that engaging in argumentation inherently follows libertarian ethics, and therefore it is a performative contradiction to argue against libertarian ethics. He defends this as follows.
The praxeological presuppositions of argumentation, then, that is, what makes argumentation as a specific form of truth-seeking activity possible, are twofold. First, each person must be entitled to exclusive control or ownership of his own physical body, the very means that he and only he can control directly at will, so as to be able to act independently of one another and come to a conclusion on his own, that is, autonomously. And second, for the same reason of mutually independent standing and autonomy, both proponent and opponent must be entitled to their respective prior possessions, that is, the exclusive control of all other external means of action appropriated indirectly by them prior to and independent of one another and prior to the onset of their argumentation.
There is some truth to this. When you argue about ethics, you're essentially arguing about how your interlocutor ought to behave. In other words, you're making use of your scarce resources, your body, the ground you're standing on, etc., in order to try to convince the other person to make use of his scarce resources, his body, the ground he's standing on, the things he uses, etc., in one way or another. Crucially, you are not using force or the threat of force in order to get him to comply. Rather, you are respecting his ownership of his property and simply trying to convince him to use that property in another way. If you did not consider him to be the owner of his property, including his body, and you the owner of yours, then why would you be arguing that he conduct himself in one way or another rather than forcing him? One reply is that it may be easier to convince him than to force him. I may make the argument that libertarian ethics is wrong, you don't own yourself and I am perfectly within my rights to force you to comply, but I am unfortunately unable to come up with a more expedient way of controlling your behavior in this instance than convincing you. I would like to force you. However, your brain is annoyingly wired up to your body, and that gives you an unfair advantage in controlling it. Thus, I am stuck trying to convince you. As for why you expect your interlocutor to respect your property rights sufficiently to allow you to argue, we can justify this on similar grounds. Perhaps you don't even really think that he ought to, merely that he will, and you're taking advantage of this. Basically, the fact that I am acting in a way that is consistent with libertarian ethics does not mean that I am accepting libertarian ethics. I am also acting in a way that is consistent with moral nihilism. I may think that nothing is really right or wrong, and just be using argumentation pragmatically for my own ends. I could even think that utilitarianism is correct, and just think that using argumentation is the best way of maximizing utility. It doesn't even rule out anti-libertarian ethics, which is a term I'm coining here, which essentially means that it is wrong to ever act in a way which is consistent with libertarian ethics. It would make me a hypocrite to argue in favor of anti-libertarian ethics, but hypocrisy is not performative contradiction. It is impossible for me to say out loud that I cannot talk. It is not impossible for me to say out loud that I should not talk, though it is hypocritical. I believe that argumentation ethics is ingenious but over-ambitious. It just doesn't prove what Hoppe wants it to prove. However, in order to show that there really is the beginnings of something brilliant in argumentation ethics, I want to propose an argument with a narrower conclusion. That argument is as follows. Engaging in argumentation for anti-libertarian ethics, defined as the ethic that says it is always wrong to act in a way which is consistent with libertarian ethics, is hypocritical because argumentation is consistent with libertarian ethics. I believe that argument really does follow. However, it is pretty useless because no one, as far as I know, argues for anti-libertarian ethics as I've defined it. However, if we move away from a priori proofs and apodictic arguments, we find that there really might be something to all of this. Argumentation certainly seems libertarian. The fact that the inverse of libertarian ethics is rendered hypocritical by the very act of arguing about ethics does start to hint towards libertarian ethics. The fact that in order to argue about ethics you must make use of scarce resources to achieve the end of voluntary cooperation does make it seem as though someone arguing too strongly against libertarian ethics might be on shaky ground. Furthermore, if you consider the fact that most people engage in argumentation even in situations where it would be more expedient for them to use force were it not for the moral presumption against force, then it really does seem like there is some element of libertarian ethics that almost everyone implicitly accepts when they argue. To be clear, these vague seemings are not strong arguments. However, perhaps it is possible to flesh them out and make them more specific. That is why I say that argumentation ethics is ingenious but overly ambitious. It does not, in its simple form, come even close to proving libertarian ethics. However, it does give us a promising way forward. Start from the nature of argumentation, use that to reveal things about ethics that people tacitly accept, and move on from there. While it is unlikely that we could ever get as far as Hoppe claims to have already gotten, making libertarian ethics as solid as 2 + 2 = 4, it may turn out that there is still a lot that we can learn about ethics from the nature of argumentation. But the work is still ahead of us. If you still don't see why I find argumentation per se to be such a brilliant philosophical starting point, then well, nobody explains it better than Hoppe himself, so I shall let him have the last word.
The question of how to begin philosophy, that is, the quest for a starting point, is almost as old as philosophy itself. In modern times, Descartes, for instance, claimed his famous cogito ergo sum as such a starting point. Mises considered the fact that humans act, that is, that humans pursue anticipated ends with means, whether successfully or not, as such a starting point. The later Wittgenstein thought of ordinary language as the ultimate point of departure. Others, such as Karl Popper, denied that any such starting point existed and could be found. As a little reflection shows, however, none of this will quite do. After all, Descartes' cogito is a proposition, and its justification comes in the form of an argument. And likewise, Mises speaks about action as an ultimate datum and presents an argument, namely that one cannot purposefully not act to justify his point of departure. And similarly, Wittgenstein's ordinary language philosophy is not just ordinary talk, but claims to be true talk about talking. That is a justification argument. And as for relativists a la Popper, to assert that there is no ultimate starting point and yet claim this proposition to be true is plain contradictory and self-defeating. In short, whatever has been claimed here as starting points, or even if the existence of such a point has been denied, they all, unwittingly and as a matter of fact, have affirmed the existence of one and the same point of departure, namely argumentation.